Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor, the RSA's Chief Executive, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's online event as part of our Bridges to the Future series, exploring ideas to shape change in the post-COVID world. I'm delighted to have the chance to talk this afternoon to two very special guests. Anneliese Dodds is Labour MP for Oxford East. In April this year, she was appointed Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, the first ever woman to hold that role. Martin Sandbu is European economics commentator for the Financial Times and author of a timely new book, The Economics of Belonging, a radical plan to win back the left behind and achieve prosperity for all. So, Anneliese, Martin, I'm delighted that you're coming to this event for us, and thank you for sharing your time with this, because I know how busy, Anneliese, you have got a very big political job, and Martin, you're promoting your new book, so we're really delighted that you've given us a bit of time today. The other bit of context for our conversation is that we want to explore some of the themes in the RSA's new Future of Work Centre report. That's a report called A Blueprint for Good Work, 8 Ideas for a New Social Contract. It's the report that proposes a range of policy solutions to meet the twin challenges of work transforming technologies and rising economic security. Economic security, insecurity, which was rising before the crisis, and of course is going to be a whole lot worse in its aftermath. So to start our conversations, I want to say something which might be controversial given your job, Anneliese, and your analysis, Martin, and that's this, that in some ways, the kind of agenda around improving working lives did have some momentum coming into this crisis. The national living wage had got to the stage where I think, according to the Resolution Foundation, we have fewer people in low pay than we've had for 40 years. And the government is still formally committed to that living wage rising to the point at which we have no low pay, because it will reach the level of 2/3 of medium earnings. We saw some reforms which resulted from my own report, Good Work, to Theresa May, and the government is committed to an employment bill which will take further some further of those recommendations, including establishing a single enforcement body. And the Chancellor, of course, when he unveiled his self-employment support package, talked about the need to think again about the way we tax self-employment and potentially the entitlements that go with self-employment. So there was quite a lot of momentum behind these ideas. So my first question, and I'll start with you, Anneliese, is this. Is the immediate danger that we've got that in a context of high unemployment, the commitment to improving working lives will be abandoned because it will feel as though the only priority is getting people back into work of any kind at all? I'll start with you, Anneliese.
Yes, I think that is potentially a danger. And in fact, we've seen following previous crises that sometimes the emphasis has been on getting people into any job, no matter how low in quality that job might be and the poor terms and conditions that might go along with it. And I would say, of course, this is coming at a time when the incidence of in-work poverty has actually been increasing. So there are big challenges there. But I'm not saying this to be sycophantic towards you, Matthew, but I really agreed with what you said in your blog recently about this, that there isn't a trade-off between more jobs and good jobs. I think that's particularly because of the productivity challenge that we've had in the UK for a very long time. We already saw in many cases that broadly that our businesses were relatively labour heavy, that we hadn't seen the investment in capital going in or the growth in that investment that occurred in many other nations. So we need to be focusing on good quality jobs into the future. I think that means critically a focus on, yes, both investment but also skills, and a number of the coordinative mechanisms that this report that's been produced, the Blueprint for Good Work, starts to investigate. And I think trade unions are going to be critical actors in developing those policies into the future.
So it's interesting to me, Anneliese, because when I worked for the Blair government, I'd always been interested in work quality. It's something that I've talked about for decades. And I used to try and raise this issue. And although, of course, that Labour government did a lot of really important things, the minimum wage and improvements in maternity, paternity, provisional flexibility at work, broadly speaking, when I talked about work quality, then colleagues in the Treasury and DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, their view was that this was a dangerous distraction from what was the government policy at that stage, which was summed up simply in the terms work first. And that's what gave rise, for example, to quite a stringent conditionality regime in our benefit systems. And that was based upon an analysis that said that almost any job is better than no job in terms of your kind of life chances. So I'm interested, you don't think that there will be any return to that kind of sense, which is, with maybe 3 million more unemployed, that we just have to put these issues it's interesting. I think even the chair of the Low Pay Commission has said that maybe we need to look at whether or not we can afford to raise the minimum wage, for example. So do you not see that trade-off at all?
Well, I think some people will say there's that trade-off. Matthew, what I was trying to say is there should not be, we shouldn't be viewing there as a trade-off, because certainly in the medium to long term, if we see a proliferation of low quality work with businesses not investing in skills or indeed in those physical elements that can provide additional productivity, then we'll be diminishing the strength of our economy and ultimately having an even slower recovery than what we would do otherwise. So I'm sure there will be some who will say, well, the point is we just need to be getting people into any kind of work. Now, we know that work does tend to make people feel like they have much more dignity than they did previously, but equally, I think what this crisis has exposed is that very many people are working in incredibly difficult conditions in ways which really don't promote their dignity, in ways which they can't plan for any kind of a family life when they're, lacking in any kind of stability and security around their future hours and so forth. Now, this crisis should not be a reason to put off dealing with those problems, because if we do that in the name of just creating jobs or promoting jobs, then we're just storing up additional problems for ourselves in the longer run, particularly, as I said, around productivity and the productivity problems we've had in the UK.
So Martin, what do you think of this challenge? You wrote your book before the COVID crisis, and so you wrote your book, and it's a brilliant book full of fantastic recommendations. But in a sense, I guess if there was an economic assumption underlying your book, was that we would be in a kind of reasonably tight labour market. The issue of the quantity of work would not be an immediate and pressing concern. Now that's shifted. So I'm interested, Martin, in how you think the debate may now feel different over the next, let's say it takes 2 or 3 years to recover, how the debate will be different.
Well, to answer that, if I can start by broadening out before narrowing it back into that, because you've both made some very important points. I want to add that this is a sort of much bigger phenomenon than a particular British one. It's also a very old phenomenon. So the problem of sort of bad jobs, of where the good jobs went, that's been going on for about 4 decades, since the late 1970s pretty much. And it's been happening in a lot of countries, including countries with very different labor markets than the UK. So you think of continental Europe, maybe there haven't been a lot of these precarious jobs, but there's been higher unemployment. And there has also been, while there have been protections for the majority of workers, there have been workers living in precarious situations for different reasons than in the UK, but equally harmful, very short-term contracts and so on, a sort of dual labor market where some people have had very poor and precarious conditions. And the third sort of big point I want to make is that these jobs are bad. They also contribute to a split of our societies, because it's not everyone who suffers these indignities. Right? It's quite well-defined people. It's people with lower education. It's often people from less advantaged social backgrounds. It's often minorities. It's often people in left-behind parts of the country, whereas there are people who work in cutting-edge knowledge industries in the big cities have fantastic work conditions. Right? So this is not it's of course an overall political problem, but it's an overall political problem because it's split peoples apart, split populations apart. There's been this sort of bifurcation. That's where we're coming from. That's where we've been coming from for 40 years. And as you pointed out at the beginning, people had started picking up on that, at least politically, if not economically. The populists, of course, did it first. They were the ones who offered the people in precarious situations, first of all, understanding. We think the system is rigged against you and it's been rigged by these elites, and vote for us and we'll blow it all up. But what COVID does is, I think, economically, it hits the same people again, right? The people who are already the most vulnerable. They're the ones who are affected most, even by the public health crisis. They are more likely to get sick and die, but also by the lockdown, by the economic remedy to the public health crisis. They're the ones who are most likely to be furloughed or lose their job altogether or have their hours cut. Whereas again, the people who had nice office-based knowledge services jobs can basically do them from home. So, and I think we've all realized that, or a lot more of us have realized that. The weekly clap for carers is a recognition of that. So we're at a moment where, you know, people have started to understand something is badly wrong in the economy. It's now clear to everyone that something is very badly wrong. And so we have a window of opportunity, I think, where there is a genuine interest. This whole rebuilding better mantra is not just a gimmick. Now, windows of opportunity have a tendency to close as more short-term concerns, political concerns come on the agenda and crowd out the bigger problems. But I think for now, there is an opportunity, and not just in the UK, but everywhere, to see that there's a moment where we could have a lot of change. Already governments have shown that they can be radical when they must. Every government has done much more than anyone would have thought possible in very little time. So radicalism is sort of the default now. Everyone's a radical in the sense of big change in little time. So there's a moment here, and it's really kind of up to politicians like Anneliese, but also citizens on the whole, to really try to accept that if we want to change this, we need to make some big changes in the year maybe going forward. It can be done, but I don't think we have an infinite amount of time before ordinary politics comes back.
Well, so Martin, let's continue with that theme of the possibilities of radical change. And so I think I've characterized this moment, and in the blog that Anneliese was very kind to mention, this is exactly how I said. I said there was momentum, both in terms of public opinion and also, you know, in terms of policy to a certain extent, behind improving people's working lives and addressing precariousness. But it's going to hit the imperatives of mass unemployment, and that's going to be the framework. That's what's going to determine. It's the kind of those two forces, the way they work out. But in terms of these radical ideas, Martin, what would you say would be the priorities if you were advising the Chancellor now? What would you say would be the kind of radical things that he might be able to do pretty quickly, which would symbolize the fact that this agenda of addressing the kind of dual labour market precariousness has not lost momentum?
Look, we have to start with a couple of principles, and I think they're principles as will come out in your report, a blueprint for good work, about how quantity of jobs shouldn't get in the way of the quality of jobs. So one principle is that you really do want to use policy in order to improve the quality of jobs. I mean, that has to be stated, right? So you need to have as a policy that you can try to aim for both. The second is not so much a principle, but you know, it's something that's important to bear in mind, is that this is not just an intellectual challenge for now, but it was in the past too, whether we believe there's a trade-off or not between quantity and quality of jobs. So if you don't think that there's a trade-off, why would you not think that? Well, you would not think that if you think that there's policy that can improve productivity and therefore makes it possible to have better jobs. So productivity really has to be at the core of this. So as we exit the crisis, we should be doing more of what we should already have been doing more of, which is to think about what are the sort of government interventions that not just employ people, but employ them productively. So let's take just one very small example. You mentioned the national living wage earlier on. There were some calls back in April for the rise not to go through because of the crisis. There was a rise scheduled for April, May. The government actually let it go through. there's good reason to think, but this is a new way of thinking about minimum wages, that raising the wage floor actually contributes to productivity. It used to be thought of pushing up minimum wages as simply helping some workers, but maybe there'll be fewer jobs for the low paid, so maybe it's not clear that it helps. It turns out that increasing wage floors can be a way to spur productivity without losing any employment. You spur productivity because a company that has to pay more for its labor needs to make sure that that labor is economically viable. This is where I think an international comparison is useful. So you look at the Nordics. They're the countries that have navigated not just COVID, some of them at least, but the last couple of decades of labor market change better than most countries. They've always had very high wages at the bottom. In those countries, it was thanks to union. They've also had high productivity growth. People tend to think that's a paradox. I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's because you've had low wages at the bottom, high wage growth at the bottom, that companies have had an incentive to invest in machines, invest in automation, even think about better work processes, to use that labor that's becoming more expensive as efficiently as possible. I think that would be one key thing for a British government to do, as we know that we're going back to an economy that looks different from where we came in anyway. There are some jobs that just won't be viable because of new public health strictures. So as you return people to work, don't try and do it on the cheap, right? Try to encourage those jobs that are actually viable, even if they pay people decently. So, push through the national living wage agenda, as they seem to be doing. That's one thing. If you're going to do that, you need to support the economy in other ways too. You need to try to put in place good training schemes so that people who may have to switch jobs are able to avail themselves of more productive, but maybe more skills-intensive jobs. And I think you want to really make sure that you give the economy the demand support it needs for a long time. So you want the jobs to switch from the bad, precarious, low-paid ones to more sustainable and more dignified ones, higher paid ones, higher productivity ones. But you need to ensure still that there is a high enough quantity of jobs available. So you don't want to give up quantity, but you do that by putting in place these structural incentives for the jobs that there are to be high paid, high productive, and a demand policy, an aggressive demand policy, whether that's the Bank of England through very low interest rates or it's bold deficit covered spending from the government, so that there's enough demand for production from businesses so that those businesses are willing to hire. So you need, move the wage floors up, put in place investor incentives for training and the facilities for people to acquire new skills, and keep the demand pressure high for a good while into the recovery. Don't take your foot off the accelerator too soon.
Well, Anneliese, I'm imagining that you wouldn't disagree with much of that, but obviously, it's a real challenge being a senior member of the shadow cabinet when the election is potentially 4.5 years away, because if you have a good policy, a popular policy, the government can steal it, and if you have an unpopular policy, it can be hung around your neck. So I'm kind of interested, partly in your response to what Martin said, whether you agree that those are the priority measures right now, but also more broadly, what's going to be your approach to economic policy making, given the kind of perils of policy making in opposition?
Yeah, I have to say, certainly around many of the critical policy issues now, if the government stole my ideas, I'd be very, very pleased indeed, because I think we'd be dealing with the current situation quite a bit better and more quickly. But anyway, I agree. I did agree genuinely with quite a bit of what Martin said, but I suppose I would also try and broaden this out a little bit to some of the themes that are talked about quite a bit in this blueprint, but then in some of the other work that the RSA has done as well. And maybe think about, some of how we conceive of productivity as well within the UK, because I would argue that in addition to some of what Martin was talking about, we also need to consider, how we'll deal with some of those kind of long-term structural challenges for the UK, the kind of regional inequalities in infrastructure, those kinds of matters where, hopefully a stimulus package might help to deal with some of them at the same time as promoting good quality employment. But then we also need to think much more intensively about parts of the economy that are so often forgotten in these kind of debates. One would be obviously around the caring economy, and there's a kind of interesting discussion about this in the Blueprint report. Currently there's a view that for those who deliver home-based care, say a 15-minute appointment is delivering good quality care. And there isn't really a consideration about really the long-term impacts of that. Now, having more labour in that sector, more employment in that sector, which is of good quality, maybe some measurements might suggest that would be overall reducing output. But if it means that a home carer can spend a bit longer with someone that they're helping, that they're not rushing in, giving them a cup of tea, giving them a quick wash and barely able to speak to them, clearly the output would be far higher quality as well. So I think we need to be considering a whole range of ways in which both kind of labour intensity can be increased in a meaningful way, decent jobs that aren't just, trying to create jobs for the sake of it. But then in parallel with that, how we can improve the quality of what's produced in the first place, especially in the public sector. And that is something that obviously government can do directly when it sets its mind to it.
Can we turn briefly to one of the specific ideas in the Blueprint report, and an idea which the RSA has talked about for some time, and that's universal basic income. Now, it's really important to say at the outset that the problem with the debate about UBI is that there are lots of very different types of UBI, and then people get asked, do they support UBI? And the only intelligent answer to that is, well, which UBI? What are you talking about? So the RSA has a very kind of modest model, which is costed, which is pretty low, but is really designed not to create a world where nobody has to work, but actually to strengthen work incentives so people don't lose their benefits as they get work, but also to reduce a sense of insecurity and to get rid of the rather pernicious impact of conditionality in the welfare system. And it's kind of interesting to me that, again, before this crisis, if you read the runes in terms of DWP policy, they had moved a long way away from the kind of really strict conditionality regime that applied in the past. So if we don't talk about UBI, but we talk about a minimum income guarantee, we said, look, every citizen needs to be able to have a minimum income, not requiring them to be able to do anything, but just as a citizen right to tackle insecurity, but also to strengthen actually their incentives to work or to try and set up a business or whatever. Now, Anneliese, you have said publicly recently that you're not a fan of UBI, but is that because of the rather idealistic notions of UBI out there, or do you have a deeper resistance to the idea of some kind of minimum income guarantee for all citizens?
So I would say, I think a lot of the criticisms that are frequently levelled against UBIs, and I agree with you, there's a plethora of different approaches to this. Many of those criticisms, I think, are completely off beam, and I very much agree with you that some of the suggestions that have been made around lack of work incentive, for example, just do not stack up in relation to many of the models that have been put forward. I think for me, I suppose there are kind of two key concerns. The first relates to the fact that, and it's an obvious point, but people have very different needs, and those different needs can be very expensive to meet if they're to be met properly, and morally they should be. If we're talking about someone with a severe disability, for example, which means they can't work to the same extent as others, if we're talking about a single parent with a number of children, those children should be supported. Somebody who lives in high-cost housing. So for me, I suppose quite often there are suggestions that, well, a UBI could just cover all of that social security, just parcel it all together and then divide it amongst everybody. Well, quite frankly, I don't need as much support as somebody who might be in those very, very needy circumstances. And my view is, as a socialist, I think it's their right to get that support when they have no alternative. So then if we say that funding must still be provided for those needs, which I know that the RSA is rightly advocated, the overall quantum that needs to be devoted to a UBI scheme becomes very, very large indeed. I mean, I noted in the report that in the long run, that could be amounting to about 90 billion for the whole of the UK. And I think, this is an interesting discussion to have, but we surely need to think very carefully about what other uses that very significant amount of funding could go to, which could have a very big impact on people's life chances. It's an obvious point, but I look at what's happened to our education system over recent years and how so many children are being let down because of inadequate funding there. I look at the crisis that we have in housing in the UK, which actually drives many of those needs because we have an inadequate supply of decent, affordable housing. And surely we need to consider that kind of very significant sum in relation to those other needs. And so that, I suppose that's where my concern's coming from. As I say, I think many of the criticisms to the right in relation to UBI are completely off beam and disproved by evidence. But I think there are some pretty big questions from the left and the progressive centre that we need to engage with.
Well, that's going to be a really interesting debate that I hope we can continue to have with you, Anneliese. But Martin, turning to you, I think are enthusiastic about
very much in favour, yeah,
some form of UBI. But can I broaden the question in the sense of I'm not sure you use this phrase in the book. In fact, you talk a lot about Roosevelt rather than talking about Beveridge. But there is a kind of sense of a kind of Beveridge 2.0 to your plan. We have, over the years, and not so much in Britain as in America, but to a certain extent, we have come to view the welfare system in very negative terms. The right caricatures it as kind of as removing people's incentives and that kind of caricature. But also the left has been very critical of the way it treats people and particularly the conditionality regime that people experience, that dealing with the state if you were unemployed is very difficult, and all the problems with the implementation of universal credit. You've talked about Scandinavia, where they have this model of flexicurity. So as well as talking about UBI, Martin, I'm interested in your kind of thoughts about what should be the nature of a welfare system that we have for people in the 21st century? What should be the principles that underpin it?
Look, the main principle is also one reason why I'm in favour of UBI. For me, UBI is not about poverty reduction. It's not even a sort of welfare and benefit issue. It's about empowerment, essentially. It's about guaranteeing a certain independence and empowerment at the individual level, basically the power to say no. So one way of understanding what I call the end of economic belonging, but you could call it the precariat, you could call it the problem precarious work, undignified work. A lot of people don't have the power to say no to what should be unacceptable work conditions, or for that matter, living conditions. That's the principle that has to orient both a narrow discussion about UBI and also a broad discussion about the welfare system in general. So why I'm in favor of an unconditional sort of payment and not a minimum income guarantee, which sounds like it's sort of withdrawn when you start to make more, but something, a real UBI, is that it lets everyone have the opportunity to say no to unacceptable shift unpredictability or unacceptable abuse at work or unacceptably low wages, and it will force employers to up their game. A little bit like a minimum wage does, it forces employers to do better, to employ people more productively, and creates the right incentives for productivity as well as giving security and empowerment at the individual level. The problem with the welfare system as it works in most countries really is that it was designed, in the area of mass industrial employment, sort of on the assumption of full employment for male breadwinners. And it's never really been updated properly to a situation where you can't expect lifetime employment and you have to expect some time in between jobs, and where increasingly work is organized on a more gig, fragmented basis. So some of the big problems in the UK economy, but many other economies, is that some people live with very erratic incomes, even if they work, and even if they work a lot of hours. So there's unpredictability and volatility in their incomes. That's bad for productivity, it's bad for health, it's bad for stress and family cohesion, it's bad for a lot of things. That's the sort of thing we have to get away from. But currently, the welfare system, partly for sort of moral, ideological reasons, it's largely based on conditioning things on being in work. You know, you have to work, but then we'll help you top up a bit. But it has to be means tested so that the undeserving don't get money. But the effect of that is that if you go in and out and work, the welfare system can amplify the insecurity and the volatility. And if you have a chance to improve your condition by yourself, you'll be penalized by that because benefits will be withdrawn. Those are the ways most Western welfare states have actually been organized and still are. So UBI is one way to radically shift from that. I think we need to get it to a point where people do have the wherewithal to safely, and I mean that in a psychological sense as well as an economic sense, live in a very shifting economy. That's what the economy looks like now. It will change fast. We will have to shift between jobs. We will have to work in more fragmented ways. And those are good things if that can be done safely for each individual. So we want the welfare system to work for a more, a more fragmented and shifting and unpredictable reality, because that's how a productive economy is today. It's not the factories of the 1950s and 60s, right? So the welfare system has to adapt to that as well. But that can be done, I think.
There are so many directions that I'd like to take the conversation in, and we're running out of time. Let me go somewhere I wasn't expecting to go, but it's been kind of provided by some of the things that you've said. It's interesting, this point about precarious work and productivity, because actually one of the kind of slightly counterintuitive realities of our labour market before the crisis, something that Andy Haldane had talked about, I'm on the Government Industrial Strategy Council, which Andy chairs, is that actually one of the things driving low productivity was people not changing their jobs often enough. So people staying too long in jobs that were not great jobs, and the fastest way to increase your salary and to increase your productivity is simply to change jobs, because you're likely to go to a slightly better job and new challenges and all that. Then when you look at why people don't change jobs, it turns out this isn't probably an issue to do with employment regulations or welfare regulations. It's probably primarily to do with housing, which is that if you move from an area of low housing demand to an area of high housing demand, you will end up eating up any of your salary gains in kind of higher house prices. Now, the reason I say all of that is that, again, one of the things we've kind of learned from COVID is some of the countries that have coped best are the ones which have strong decentralization, where local cities have had the capacity to take leadership, and that's been part of their resilience. So Anneliese first, and then to you, Martin, how important is decentralization to the economic agenda in a kind of post-COVID world, that we do need places to be more able to be in charge of their own economic destiny, given how incredibly, we have the widest economic disparities, regional economic disparities in Europe, for example. So first to you, Anneliese.
It's clearly critically important. It was important before this crisis, and it's even more significantly important now. And I think it's not just critical around some of the issues we've been talking about connected to good and decent work and local housing infrastructure, and people's ability to actually get into the labour market at a level that matches their skills and experience. I would say it's also critically important because of what will need to be an eventual transition, obviously, to a circular economy, given the climate crisis and other environmental imperatives. And I think we've seen really in the UK over the last few weeks that sometimes intermediate institutions have come in at a regional level to try and coordinate economic challenges. So we've seen, for example, in where I'm talking to you from here in Oxfordshire, that the local LEP and councils and others and trade unions and business groups, they've been working together around some of the production challenges with protective equipment. But that is a really big gap, I would argue, in the UK's set of circumstances compared to many other nations where you've got that much more developed machinery already there. And I think, again, it's interesting just thinking today, where we will have the unemployment statistics coming out tomorrow. I've been talking to many of those regional level actors in the UK, as you'd anticipate, and they already have, really interesting plans and ideas about the kind of employment support that will be needed in their area. If you think about a place like Blackpool, for example, where very, very high levels of employment in hospitality, lots and lots of people, unfortunately, quite far away from that jobs market even before this crisis hit. Very, very different circumstances from, say, somewhere like Crawley, lots and lots of people furloughed, but traditionally people coming quite quickly into the jobs market. So we need to have that, certainly that decentralised approach. I don't feel we've got the institutions ready there yet, so we need to work on that very quickly indeed.
When you say the institutions, Anneliese, does that suggest that you think that we do need to think again about regional coordination in terms of economic policy?
Well, I would say even before that, I wouldn't get hung up around the structures, and that can take a very long time, of course, to work through. But I suppose you might expect me to say this as a Labour politician, but some of the work that local authorities in particular are just starting to do around, looking at, they've been given responsibility for a healthy start and a safe start to their local areas by central government. So they're having to plan what city centres, town centres can look like, how they can be safe. But they don't have any kind of income certainty. I think, we do need to be providing the resources for this to happen. I think that would be good value, actually, in the long term to enable that kind of tailored response that's necessary.
So Martin, I want to turn the question to you, but I'll give it an extra spin because I want to refer to the kind of core thesis of your book, because as I understand reading the book, I didn't realize until I read it that in many ways, one of the things you really want to drive home in your book is that globalization doesn't have to be a problem if the domestic policies are right. So you're responding to the rise of anti-globalization on both the left and the right. So I'm interested in your sense about where economic power needs to lie if you want a system which addresses the concerns that we've been talking about. The global level, the national level, the local level. One of the things we talk about in the Blueprint report is workers' rights to data, for example. And when I read, as I seem to do every day, lots of reports about the future after the pandemic, one of the points everybody wants to make is that the great global American technology giants will have even more power because they can suck up even more firms. They've got enormous capital reserves. So there's this question of economic power and where it should lie, Martin. I'm fascinated by your perspective on that.
How to do justice to your questions, very big questions. But let me just pick up where you started the previous question on how one obstacle to productivity is that people don't change jobs enough. A different way of saying that is that people are stuck in bad jobs, and that description may do more justice to how it's experienced. Which are the countries in Europe that have the fastest job-to-job switch rate? They're Denmark and Sweden. Danish workers change jobs much more often than UK workers, for example. Now, why is this? It's because the Nordics, they make it easy to switch jobs. They help people switch jobs. They spend the most on active labor market policies that are designed to help people find a new job. They probably also have the security at the bottom that I talked about earlier. For some people, it's expensive to switch jobs, right? If you can't leave one job on a Friday and go to the next one on Monday, that may be because it's in a different city, but it may not be. It may just be because it's not available that Monday. You have to go 2 weeks without a paycheck in between, and you might not have that money. So these issues all go together. And of course, the Nordics are very good at spending a lot of money on training, education, having high general transferable skills, which this country has let too large a share of the population be without. Now, all of that can be fixed or can be addressed even at a central level. Right? So you can have policies to make it easier to switch from worse jobs to better jobs, even at the national level. There's no your institutional, your division of power between levels is not an excuse for not doing that. But on top, of course, many countries have problems with vast regional inequalities. Some regions just have much worse paid, less productive jobs than than the big cities. And it's really about productivity again, because you can redistribute income from London to the regions. But what you really want to fix is the big gap in productivity, that the jobs in the regions aren't as productive as those in London. And in order to make that happen, you do need to have powers at the right levels. That doesn't simply mean letting the local level do everything. I think a lot of it really has to do with having the central level and the local level work together on the sort of things they can do. I mean, it's very hard, but one goal has to be to make left behind areas attractive places in their own rights for the sort of jobs that are the cutting edge jobs in the modern economy. High paid, high productivity, high skilled knowledge jobs. So you need a sort of critical mass of those in left behind areas to turn them around, rather than, you know, hoping to go back to the jobs of the past. That requires local knowledge. You know, you need local authorities, and the places that have done this, not just in the UK but elsewhere, places that have done this successfully have been the one where there are local leaders that both understand what the opportunities are. So you think about Grand Rapids, Michigan as an example, where you have these anecdotes of cling film manufacturers being turned into medical wrapping manufacturers. Right? They managed to maintain some manufacturing expertise by upskilling it. But of course, you also need responses at central level. Part of that is investing in infrastructure to connect these places. But that's not all. There really has to be a concerted national policy to bring some of those skilled jobs, make them viable in more places than just the capital. One thing that seems to work is to put research institutions, research universities in peripheral regions. And that seems to create this critical mass, enough jobs that it builds on itself. But to bring this to the global level, the success there will be for these, you know, turned around, left behind areas we're hoping for, to be part of the global economy, to have things that there is demand for globally. Some, you know, if it's manufacturing, it's some specialized high-skilled manufacturing product that can sell everywhere. Or it can be a service, it can be coding, it can be, we don't know what it's going to be. But for it to be really productive, it's going to be something that's plugged into the global economy, not cut off from it. So this is just one example of why I say globalization is not the enemy. If you get the national and local policies right, globalization helps you along the way because it creates those further opportunities. You don't want to cut yourself off from the world, and you don't want to cut the most suffering places off from the world. They're too cut off as it is, not just from the world, but even from the capital. You want to connect them, and you want to connect them to the global level as well.
So, Anneliese, last question for you. You know, anti-globalization, or the reaction against globalization, really started on the left, actually, and then was adopted by populists of different kinds of persuasions. We obviously are now going to start focusing a bit more, hopefully, if the pandemic is receding, on Brexit. I'm just interested in, as Labour's economic policymaker, chief policymaker, where are your instincts in relation to globalization? Do you share the view of those who think that there is some kind of trade-off between what is sometimes called hyperglobalization and the capacity of countries to protect their own populations?
Yeah, you're not going to like this, but I think it does depend on what we call globalization, surely. And I shouldn't really say this with Martin on the call, because obviously he's done a lot of thinking about exactly what the core elements are. I mean, I think if we suggest that liberalization, you know, the extension and growth of untrammeled markets to an extent, if that has to be a component of globalization, then obviously that does pose a number of issues, and they're fairly obvious ones that the left has rightly been campaigning on. But if we instead are talking about globalization as increasing international connectedness, then I think we're in quite a different space, actually, and, you know, a more interesting one. I mean, I think there are few who would suggest that, you know, for example, the power of some of those very, very large companies that you talked about, which, I mean, it's an obvious point, but, you know, easily in terms of the resources that they can corral, as much as that of some different low-income nations, the extent to which they can play countries off against each other. If we were to suggest that shouldn't be tackled, clearly that would be problematic. I suppose where some might say that there's kind of a discussion even of that more limited conception of globalization, which I think is a more interested one, i.e. international interconnectedness, is around discussions around onshoring that are occurring currently. And I'm skeptical about some of these because I think, clearly, again, from an environmental perspective, we should be seeking to shorten many supply chains when we can, if that reduces transport intensivity and use of carbon, makes a more circular economy. But just talking about reducing those supply chains for their own sake, for example, through imposing additional trade barriers, the likely impact of that most of the time is that you're just going to disrupt those supply chains and lead to businesses folding. So I think, this is becoming a bit of a kind of buzz phrase currently around onshoring without necessarily thinking through what the implications are and whether it's really always going to be in the interests of UK businesses. Some contexts, and indeed UK jobs, some contexts it could be, particularly if it's allied with those environmental imperatives, but in other contexts, I really don't think that it would be at all.
May I pick up very, very quickly?
Very quickly, Martin.
Just because it's such an important point that Anneliese makes, that the way I would phrase it is that we should not allow there to be a confusion or a conflation between globalization and deregulation. These are different things. But there are a lot of people who want it to be the same thing. It's the anti-globalist left want to conflate them because they don't want deregulation, and the pro-globalist right will conflate them because they want deregulation, but they'll argue in favor of globalization as a way to get it. But these are different things. So you can open up to trade, to migration, to investment, while imposing strict standards. And there's nothing anti-globalist about making sure that the same standards apply both to homemade and foreign production or workers, for example. So these are very separate things, and it would do us all a favor to be able to treat them as separate things.
Well, what better way to end our conversations than by exploding a false dichotomy? Look, I wish we were having this conversation as part of a weekly podcast, because I could talk to both of you for ages, and we've only touched the surface of some of these questions. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for the time that you've given us, Martin and Anneliese. If you're watching along today, do head over to the RSA website now to find more details on Martin's book, The Economics of Belonging, which comes highly recommended and certainly should be on every policymaker's desk, alongside, of course, a copy of the RSA Future of Work Centre's new report, A Blueprint for Good Work, which you'll also find links to on the site, as well as all the latest Bridges to the Future policy briefings from our research colleagues across the RSA, in addition to news from our growing global fellowship community. And we'd love to hear your ideas on what's needed to shape the recovery and drive good work in the post-pandemic future. We're very keen to work with local authorities, for example, in thinking about how to manage recovery in a way which minimizes insecurity. So do get involved in the online conversation across social media using the hashtag RSA Bridges. So finally, thank you again to Anneliese Dodds and Martin Sandbu, and thank you all for watching.